Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. I've been asked to do a video on how I learned Mandarin. Now, I thought I had done a video on that subject because I've done videos on how I learned other languages, but I haven't done one, I guess, on Mandarin. I looked through my YouTube videos, couldn't find any. So, I'm going from memory, and first of all, I'm doing this. It's a request that I received from, I think his name was Frederick from Denmark. Please excuse me if I can't remember the first name. I'm not going to be bothered looking it up right now. And I'm going to do it in English, and then I'm going to do it in Japanese because I haven't done a Japanese video in quite a while. So, it all started back in 1967, I believe. I was in the Canadian Government Trade Commissioner Service. I found out that they were going to send someone to somewhere to learn Chinese because they needed to train someone up in Mandarin because Canada was getting ready to recognize the People's Republic of China. So I immediately started taking lessons from a guy at the Taiwanese embassy who was a hopeless teacher. I didn't learn much, but I was able in a couple of 6 weeks or so to tell my bosses in the diplomatic service that I am interested, and what's more, I have already started studying. And that sort of gave me the inside track. And so then they said, okay, we've decided you're going to be our language student, and you have a choice. You can go to Monterey, to the U.S. Defense Institute language school there, or you can go to Hong Kong. And so I said, I want to go to Hong Kong. And of course, Hong Kong is Cantonese speaking, but in those days they have the Cultural Revolution going on in China, and Taiwan wasn't a very suitable place if you wanted to participate in dealings with the People's Republic. They were very fussy on both sides about people who were involved in either of the other, call it the other China. So, and then I went to Hong Kong, and I decided I had a choice between the Hong Kong University on Hong Kong side, very comfortable right by all the beaches, or down in Kowloon, in amongst all the crowds of Chinese people, and I decided to go to Kowloon and study at the New China College, Yale and China Center there. So I lived in Kowloon side. I used to take my scooter to the school every day. It was very hot. There was no air conditioning. And I'm going from memory now, but we had classes. We might have had 5 hours a day to start with, but I very soon said that's too much. So I switched to 3 hours a day. A lot of the classes consisted of drills. But I would say that my major activity, I should say at the outset that basically I passed the British Diplomatic Service advanced exam after essentially 10 months of study, which was twice as fast, more than twice as fast as previous language students. And the main reason I did that is because I read and listened an awful lot. I mean, everyone had classes, many had more classes than I did, with drills and one thing and another, but I just read a lot. So what I want to show you here is, we started out with a thing called Chinese dialogues, and I still remember that everyone thought that they were read so quickly that we could, I mean, are they deliberately trying to talk so fast that we can't understand, we felt. And Chinese dialogues has no Chinese characters in it. It is all in Wade Giles, which is the equivalent of pinyin. It was the romanization system that was used in those days. So I listened to that many times. It was a story about people traveling from Shanghai to Peking to whatever, and of course we couldn't travel in those places, so it sounded a bit unrealistic, but it was kind of an initiation of the language, and you always have to start with some kind of beginner material, so the Chinese dialogues was our introduction to Chinese. But very quickly thereafter, we got on to stuff that was more interesting, and I'm going to show you what my reading consisted of. The next book I went to was this, 20 Lectures in Chinese Culture, a great book, and that got you into the history and the culture of China, so it was actually interesting, and that makes it a lot easier to learn from. I think I also managed to, I was always prowling around the bookstores in Hong Kong, and I found geography books and history books written for people with limited character knowledge. Just a word on characters, we had flashcards, written by handwritten by one of our teachers at Mr. Wei, beautifully handwritten, and 1,000 of these flashcards, and I learned my first 1,000 characters from the flashcards, and I have mentioned this before. I had this squared paper, and I would pick the first flashcard, write the character. If it was wo, I go wo, 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 write the character 10 times, then put wo, or the meaning, I, 3 columns over on this squared paper. Then I pick the next one up, which might be ta, and then I go ta, 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 and then I write ta or he over, another few lines. And I kept on doing that, and eventually, of course, you run into the first character you've written. So it's kind of like a primitive spaced repetition system. And I started out with 10 characters a day, and I eventually got it up to 30. But of course, I kept on shuffling in the characters that I had already learned, because my retention rate was whatever, 20-30% every day. But nevertheless, in doing that and in reading a lot, and of course noticing, the components of the characters and so forth, pretty soon the number of characters I had increased. So the next book I went to, and I still claim this is the best Chinese book I have ever, and one of the best language learning books I have ever come across. It's called Intermediate Reader in Modern Chinese. I mean, this is what I used in 1968. So that's getting on in years here. And I loved it because it introduced you to authentic material. There were, texts from, and don't forget, as I'm learning Chinese, I'm getting into, not only, to some extent, ancient history, but mostly the history after, post-1911, the nationalist revolution, and that whole period where different thinkers are commenting on the impact of the West and what they should do, and of course the warlords and Sun Yat-sen and all this kind of stuff. And so these here are documents, many of them, from that period, and you work your way through until you start to get to, the communist period. So it had, the actual text, and then it had a glossary, phenomenal glossary, and it had patterns, and the way, they had all kinds of S1, VP1. I could never figure out what a lot of this stuff meant. VP1 plus S2 plus 才有能会可以. So 只有 blah 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 才有才能才可以. So I would get the hang of 只有才. Okay, that means only whenever can you. So that was a pattern. Or 只要就可以. 只要就可以. So they would introduce all those, and 好比 sure. So they would use 为了让它起见. So they would introduce all these patterns, and I would focus on the patterns, and then I would read these texts, and I would review the vocabulary. And I spent, a good month or two on the intermediate reader, and that's where I really charged ahead of other people, because that then took me up to quite a significant level. By then we were starting to read the newspaper, and most of what we read was communist newspapers, and we were into, our good friend Mao Zedong there, Mao Zedong Xuanji, and we would read some of his stuff. Extremely boring. It's the same stuff over and over again. But I was able to go down to the bookstores, and I read on my own much more than anybody else. So I read, here we have Readings in Contemporary Chinese Literature Essays. And all of these books had glossaries. Oh, one thing I should point out, you see I have the glossaries, and you'll notice that the glossaries are just full of my scratchings. Full of my scratchings, underlines, trying to notice, trying to remember, do whatever I can to try to remember all these, terms. So that was one. There's a whole collection of them. What do we got here? This is Readings in Contemporary Chinese Literature, Volume 1, Plays and Poems. Readings in Contemporary Chinese Literature. This was a great book, and all of the leading writers of China in the 1920s and 30s are here. And some wonderful stories, including my all-time favorite, Kong Yi Ji, written by Lu Xun. And what have we got here? Selected readings in Chinese communist literature. So more of the same stuff. So, I read all that stuff, and all these books, of course, come with glossaries. Here's a Lu Xun reader as well, and it also comes with a glossary. Most of them are from the Yale in China series. Then, of course, I also attempted literary Chinese, but we didn't have to do it, and I just found it it wasn't too relevant to my situation. It was fun. If I ever have the time, I'll go back, and I'd like to do it. So then came a point where I was actually able to read my first novel all by myself without the glossaries, 骆驼祥子. Okay, this is the Rickshaw Boy by Lao Shu. I mean, that was a major achievement for me. So that was my reading. And I haven't got all the books. Like, I got lots of books. I read tons. And I listened. We had a history of the Second World War. We had, tapes from our dialogues or from our what we were reading. And then the big revelation was the Xiangshan. And I don't have them here, but I've got tons of Xiangshan CDs. My favorite is Ho Balin, but I used to listen to the Xiangshans because that gets the rhythm of the language going. So I was attending my classes, I was reading, I was listening. And basically that was it. And we had to write, so I wrote. And that basically got me to where I passed the test. But my Chinese is much better today than it was when I wrote the exam, because I have continued. And there's so much stuff available for Chinese learning. I go out and buy books, 中国传统文化概要, 概论. So there, I read a book on Chinese culture. Then there's 中国史简变. Okay, so you can read a bit about Chinese history. I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read different parts of it. When I get interested in a certain era, I'll go in there and read on that era. I have other Chinese books. I have one that's a translation of a Cambridge history, because this tends to be very much the sort of Chinese communist, scientific, whatever they call it, something or other, dialectical materialism or some such nonsense. But I read other sources as well. If you're into audio, I mean, there is no place where there are more audio material than in China. You can get audio stuff on history, on philosophy, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, 中国历史, or you can get this whole series here, which is 红楼梦, or 水浒传. So, I mean, there is just no shortage of stuff. All I don't have is time, because I've been busy learning, Russian and Czech, and now I'm working on Korean and so forth. But, so, I mean, I've tried to remember all the things that I did. I'd like to get into more history. I buy lots of books. I got like 10 times this number of books, half of which I've never read. This one here is a fascinating collection of articles about history. And of course, it has all these historical references. And one of my thoughts when we got involved in setting up LingQ is, if I could read this electronically, and every time a name came up, it's a very nicely illustrated book. Every time a name came up, if I could click on that name or place name or name of a famous person and get all kinds of background on that person and save it into my database, so I start accumulating, just as I accumulate vocabulary in LingQ, I could accumulate my knowledge of personalities in Chinese history. Maybe one day, if I ever get the time to do it, or if these kinds of, online encyclopedias that you can link to while you're reading in Chinese, if these ever become available. So, there you have it. Overwhelmingly reading and listening. And I'm finding now with my Korean that a lot of the sort of simple beginner stuff, I can't hack it. Didn't with Czech. 1 month and I'm out of there. I would rather struggle with something difficult. Read it, build up my vocabulary, and at a certain point, you have enough words that now you can go back and you can start communicating with people and so forth. But to have to struggle with stuff that is written at a level that has only got so many new words, and therefore they only introduce simple words, and therefore the content is very simple and stuff, I no longer have the patience to do that. You have to get into the real stuff. And that's what I did with Chinese at an early stage, and that's why I think I was able to do it more quickly than essentially any of the other students who were in the diplomatic service, whether Canadian, American, Japanese, or whatever, back in Hong Kong in 1968. So there you have it. And Frederick, I hope that answers your question. Let me know if you have any other questions. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.